So Law Transform is owned by the University of Bergen and the Christian Michelsen Institute. And so we have one representative from the University of Bergen, Lise Rischa, who's head of the Department of Government, where we are based at the University of Bergen. But we're also owned jointly by the Social Science Faculty and the Law Faculty. But this is where we're administratively based. And we'll also hear from the Dean of the Law Faculty on Wednesday. We also have Torun Wimpelmann here. Yes, here. Too close. From the Christian Michelsen Institute, and you're actually going to start. And then we also have Jostein Kobbeltvedt, who's external in a way. He's external member of the board, but very much a close collaborator as head of the Rafter Foundation of Human Rights in Bergen. So you're going to go in that order. So I'll let you start.
Lined up. Thank you so much, Siri. It's a great privilege and pleasure to welcome you all to the opening of the 2024 Bergen Exchanges on Law and Social Transformation on behalf of CMI. And the 10th anniversary that Siri spoke about is an occasion for gratitude, despair, and joy. Gratitude for what Bergen Exchanges has become, a meeting place where scholarly and practical insights, energy, and solidarity is found in abundance. And CMI is incredibly lucky that this event is happening in Bergen every year, featuring discussions and lectures on so many of the topics that we also work, such as democracy, climate, gender rights, natural resources, and of course, law. So many of our researchers get inspired and stimulated by this momentous week-long exchange. And we're so grateful to all of the great scholars, activists, and professionals who have traveled to Bergen from across the globe, knowing that long flights and visa regimes makes this no small effort. In some ways, the time of the 10th anniversary of the Bergen Exchanges is also an occasion for despair. Many of this year's themes have grown from significant to existential threats to large parts of the world during the lifespan of Bergen Exchanges from it started. Autocracy is one election away from being realized in many places, and the relative global indifference or active complicity to the horrific suffering and obliteration of the people in Sudan, Gaza, and elsewhere makes coloniality a very current topic. And of course, climate change remains a threat to everyone. And at the same time, as the closer we might be eyeing catastrophe, and some of us are, of course, much geographically closer to that than others here, perhaps it's easier to see the true importance or the necessity of resistance, another theme of this year's events. And Bergen Exchanges has always been a place to learn from those fighting close up against oppression and the erosion of democracy, whether through law, art, or activism. And it's also a place where there is no contradiction between joy and work, where it would be seen common sense to make joy part of resistance. So Sarah, Liv, Lara, and all the volunteers, on behalf of CMI, I would like to thank you so much for all the work that you continue to put down to make Bergen Exchanges possible. And I'm sure this week will be as stimulating as ever, and me and everyone from CMI is extremely grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. This is going to be a bit repetitive, but we're very, very excited to be here, and I'm so excited to see all of you. And we're so happy to take part and to support Bergen Exchanges and the Center of Law and Social Transformation, which is a really important event every year, and now for 10 years, which is really great. So this is an excellent event many of you know it because you've been here for the 10 years that this has been going on, but some are new to this, and this is just an excellent event and an excellent place to meet, to discuss and to elaborate with fellows across disciplines, which I think is very important, and also across countries and continents on these very, very important topics that matter greatly for all of us. Fostering networks, pursuing and developing new and important research agendas and research ideas is also, this is the place to be. Whether it concerns democracy, autocracy, governance, democratization, gender issues, inequality, there are so many interesting topics. Also, if you, I mean, just looking at the program, it's just heaven for those who are interested in all of these things, and those who aren't, they should be. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and making this gathering possible. I know there are a lot of people who have worked very hard, not just for this event, but for over the last 10 years to keep this vibrant community, letting them meet. So I just want to wish you all the best of luck for the next coming days, and I'm really looking forward to a lot of the exciting things on the program. So thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to Bergen. The sun is shining, and for those who you are regulars to Bergen, you know that's not to be taken for granted. So see it as a sign of Bergen welcoming you. So my name is Jostein Hole Koboltvedt. I'm the executive director of the Rafter Foundation, and for the last year or so, I've been lucky to be one of the external board members of the external board member of the Law Transform. And I'm really happy to be here for the 10-year anniversary of the Bergen Exchanges. The Rafter Foundation for Human Rights, we believe that rule of law, independent courts are critical and essential to upholding human rights and democracy. But we also believe that it depends on individuals and organizations that stand up for human rights, that challenge those with power and influence to protect and respect human rights. And that's why we have, for 37 years from the city of Bergen, been supporting human rights defenders worldwide. But it's also why we have quite a huge program, education program on human rights and democracy towards schools in Norway from Bergen. We also believe that human rights, how they are applied, how they are interpreted, are never constant. It needs to evolve as it faces new challenges, new contexts, as it always is. And for us, really, Bergen Exchanges is about that. It's about evolving how we interpret, how we apply human rights in changing times, in changing contexts. And for the Rafter Foundation, being in Bergen, being situated here among the university faculties, we've always piggybacked on being close to academia. And we always make sure to involve also academics in our work and students in various ways. So we are, in that sense, we enjoy being in this very symbiotic relationship with the University of Bergen, and something we take great pride in. And really, Bergen Exchanges is really the highlight of the year in this. This is really where when we can see the power of bringing together researchers and academics from around the world to Bergen and look ahead at the challenges facing those of us who are concerned about human rights and democracy. And it's really something that is important at a time when we see that independent courts are being challenged more and more, when we see autocracy on the rise many places, when we see backlash against democracy, against minorities, where we see laws are being changed to counter human rights, then we need gatherings like these. We need the expertise that you represent. And for us, the exchanges have always also been an important area and meeting place where human rights practitioners and human rights defenders can meet with academics and share perspectives and views. And as always, also have a very good time. So on the 10-year anniversary, just congratulate to Siri, to Law Transform, to everyone who's making this possible every year. It's really one of the highlights of the year for us and my colleagues. And as the sign said when we were walking up all the stairs up here this morning, keep going. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all three of you. And as you realize, we have a great board. Very, very good. So we're actually on time, and more than time. So that for our first panel. I guess I don't have to use the microphone even. Yeah. So, and of course, given the times, and also I forgot to mention that we have the Bergen Exchanges is also a PhD course. Could all the PhD students stand up? So we have. So take a good look at them. We have 19 excellent scholars from across the world coming here this year. Some of them have their posters for their projects on the wall. You should really take a close look. And they have already been at work for 2 weeks with online lectures and work on their own in groups. And now this is also part of the whole Bergen Exchanges is part of the course, and you'll also see them on stage. All of them will be on stage at some point. So thank you. So that is also a very important part, because it is also sort of, in addition to all the other cross-disciplinarity, it's also a cross-generational event, but also the way we're thinking and horizontal. But one of the special tracks of the course is on democracy and autocratization. And that is also the opening session that we have now, where we have the opening keynotes, is on democracy, autocratization, and resistance. And we'll have global perspectives. So I would like to have the keynote speakers on the stage now, all 4. So I will wait until they're there, and then I will introduce them. Very forcefully making the point that in the 10 years of the exchanges, a lot has happened with governance around the world. Many states, even states that remain democracies, are feeling different pressures than before. And one of them, and in this session, we'll look at it from different vantage points across the globe, and we'll start with a global perspective and also a discussion of what do we mean by democratic backsliding? How can we know? How do we measure? And to start us off and help us with that, we're very, very lucky to have Karl-Henrik Knudsen, who is not only, clearly, Norway's main sort of political science professor on these issues, and has been working on this for a long time, involved in measuring it in different ways. I'll let you talk about that. Also involved in, many of you have probably used the VDAM database, which has also been involved in. But he also has a long history with the Bergen Exchanges and with Law Transform. I think probably you were already in 2015.
That's probably right.
For the first proper Bergen Exchanges. So we're so happy to have you back. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Siri. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for inviting me here. I should also note that I haven't actually been here since 2015, so it was about time that I returned to. Well, I've been in Bergen several times, but not at the Bergen Exchanges, and I'm so happy to be here. Thanks to the organizers, and great to see such a crowd. The talk is democratic backsliding, conceptualizing, measuring, and global trends. So we're going to do a very quick and brief tour over kind of different ways of thinking about democracy. Just going to be super quick on that. Then talking a little bit about measurement. How do we actually go about in measuring what democracy is? Because we need to know how we measure democracy if we are going to measure, let's call it backsliding, or we could talk about autocratization. There are different terms out there with slightly different meanings. So we might also return to that. So I don't know if I'm just going to get... there it is. Oh, great, then I have full control. Basically the figure that you see right behind me, or hopefully my head is not covering too much of the figure.
It's also
Yeah. Is the main graph of the so-called varieties of democracy, or the VDEM project, which I'm, as Siri mentioned, a part of, which is a global democracy measurement project where, kind of drawing on the knowledge of approximately 4,000 country experts, we dig into different distinct features of democracy, different institutions, different processes, how these institutions work, and code about 500 indicators of pertaining to democracy one way or another. And the idea behind this database is basically that you can take these different 500 pieces, select a few of them, and put them together to measure different concepts of democracy, different ways of thinking about and defining democracy. And that is important because democracy is, as you have probably all read someplace, it's a contested concept. So there's no agreement among political scientists or others in exactly what democracy is. There's not kind of complete confusion and arbitrariness, but there is quite a lot of different notions of democracy. So you have the more strict minimalist thinking of democracy. So democracy is mainly about free and fair elections with multi-party competition, and that's a very restricted view. And that is, as the VDEM figure indicates, that is at the core of, I would say, most used democracy definitions, even the more extensive ones, kind of free and fair elections at the national level. If you measure democracy at the state level, that is at the core. Then you can add different aspects of democracy. You could add, for example, how public policy debates are entered, so deliberation in policy, so you have more deliberative definitions of democracy. Other types of participation outside of elections in civil society, for example, participatory definitions of democracy, and yet other definitions pertain more to kind of the protection of rights, constraining even elected chief executives, so more liberal notions of democracy. So this is the underlying notion of this VDEM project, that we want to be able to measure these different concepts of democracy. And for these different measures, we do tend to find somewhat different trends in democracy. So kind of your conclusions of how poorly the world is doing is basically reflecting to a certain extent what kind of definition of democracy you are choosing and what measures you're using. So to kind of preface some of the discussions later, if you have a more liberal notion of democracy, focusing on civil rights a lot and restrictions on executive power, the world is doing kind of worse than if you're only focusing on free and fair elections, because these liberal aspects have been kind of particularly under attack. But the overall story, I think in recent years, kind of if you want to do a very kind of broad brush discussion, it remains the same. So it's been going down globally, and this is what I'm talking about. It varies dramatically across countries. It's been going down globally, but perhaps not as much as kind of the most pessimistic views indicate. And I'll get back to why. So this is just, and I have to be quick. Fortunately, there's a clock ticking in front of me, so I have some kind of overview over how I'm doing. But this is the basic underlying notion of how we construct these democracy indices. So, for example, the polyarchy index, which is the core electoral democracy index in VDEM. So this is a more minimalist measure, but still it's quite extensive. So in order to have kind of a good, well-functioning electoral democracy, you don't only need to have elections with multiple parties. You also need to have kind of extensive suffrage. You need to have freedom of speech and a decent media environment in order for voters to be informed. And you also need freedom of association for opposition parties to be able to form and function in the way that they are intended to do. So this is just to show you how this electoral democracy index is constructed from 5 different sub-indices, which again is constructed from a lot of more specific indicators. So for example, on clean elections, there will be an indicator on election violence, or actually 2, and there will be one on kind of vote buying, for example. And this index, and of course there's a lot of methodology that I can't go into here, but the way this index is constructed, it's a scale. So the democracy, according to this measure, comes in degrees from 0 to 1. So North Korea, Saudi Arabia, very, very close to 0. There's no country that's close to 1 because democracy as an ideal is extremely hard to achieve. So even the highest scorers on this index has around 0.9. So Norway is towards the top. But here's a map of the world in 2023 according to this index. And my co-panelists will go into the different regions later. So this is the kind of the historical, so this is the global average. So let's say that we take the democracy score for each country. We weigh them equally. So Fiji is weighted equally to China, regardless of population size, and we take the average. And this is how the development on this index has looked. You can see towards the very, oh, this was a bad idea. And there, yeah. Yeah. There has been a slight downturn. And you can see the blue shades here. There's a lot of uncertainty exactly how poorly it's going, depending on different aspects. But it's that democracy has been going down, but maybe not as much on average as many people believe. So one reason for this is that kind of what aspects of democracy you are really focusing on, and these composite democracy measures, they contain a lot of specific indicators. So the blue solid line at the top, that's suffrage. So regardless of what kind of autocratization processes we see today, suffrage tends to be kind of, even these kind of electoral authoritarian countries do tend to hold multi-party elections with full universal suffrage. That was not something that was true 100 years ago, but this is something that is not kind of being altered in this recent wave of autocratization. However, when it comes to freedom of speech, for example, freedom of association, those indicators are really going down. So it depends a bit on what aspects of democracy you are focusing on. I'll be very quick on this. There's a recent, so if you're really interested in democracy measurement and how that affects our evaluations of how poorly the world is doing these days, I really kind of recommend a special issue in PS Political Science that came out this year on the topic of kind of how we measure democracy, how that influences our judgments about kind of recent trends. And the start point, it should have been Little and Meng, not Meng and Little, but Little and Meng's paper, which gained a lot of traction also before it was published, indicated that these VDEM data that I just showed you had a particular problem in that experts were evaluating a lot of these scores. And given the current kind of public debate, we are becoming increasingly skeptical about the prospects of current democracy. Therefore, our evaluations, when these experts are coding these measures on election violence, for example, they're colored by those judgments. So there might be some bias in these measures. So we are underestimating the recent democracy levels due to our kind of pessimism. So that might account for some of the dip, but according to my own co-authors' response in that paper, we don't see kind of very clear evidence that this is a very big driver of these downward trends. But the more general point, I think that measurement really drives our influences about how poorly the world is doing. That is a very valid one. So, for example, if you weight by population size, and look at the kind of global democracy scores weighted by population size, the world is doing a lot worse than if you weigh all countries equally. And that's actually bad news, right? Because the large countries where a lot of people live are, on average, for reasons we are, I wouldn't say we have any clear idea as to why, the larger countries are currently doing worse on average. I'll show you a figure in a while. It's also kind of other things related to, so what indicators are you looking at? So are you looking at, for example, freedom of speech, media, civil how civil society is faring? It's going much, much worse than if you're only focusing on the execution of elections, which is not doing as bad. So it's important to use a broad spectrum of indicators to look at democracy trends. So here is kind of one figure. So focus on the green line versus the one that's on the top towards the end, the purple line. So the purple line is when you weigh all countries equally. You can see that the downward trend is not that great in recent years. The green line is a population-weighted line, including India, so for all countries. You can see that that has gone down dramatically. The red one at the bottom, which has declined less steeply, is the population one, weighted one, excluding India. And that has had a much less steep decline. So you can really see that India, large country with kind of with a large population, and which has had a quite notable downturn in recent years, is driving a lot of the population-weighted downturn. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so what characterizes these countries then that have had, let's call it democratic reversals, that have been going in the wrong direction if you take a democracy-autocracy continuum? Either starting from a relatively high level or from a relatively low level, you can become more autocratic. And I think that's one of the key features we see in this let's call it the wave of autocratization, that we have observed these kind of downturns for countries starting at very different levels of the scale, both very established democracies, which is kind of not something we've experienced in other parts of recent history, as well as countries in the middle and towards the bottom. So it's been a fairly kind of comprehensive development. It's also touched different regions, and that's also very different from earlier waves of democratization and autocratization, which have often been very region-specific. So it's been global. The main culprit, elected leaders, often in free and fair elections, who gradually concentrate power in their own hands. I guess you all know this story by now, but that's really been the main driver, even if you've seen the return of military coups, especially in the last couple of years. Very gradual, stepwise processes. And there's a sequence, it seems, there's a typical sequence to many of these processes. So it doesn't go for all countries, but very often you see indicators pertaining to freedom of speech, autonomy of courts, kind of these kind of softer supporting pillars of democracy moving first, and then elections being manipulated only later on in the process. And I guess I should speed up. So here is just, I think I'll skip this one. So this basically pertains to showing how different indicators have moved very differently over these last years, and end with this kind of more optimistic note slide. So you can see at the top, so this is from 1910 or to recent years. So these are the number of countries that kind of significantly, clearly and statistically significantly, in a clear manner, either democratize, the blue ones at the top, or autocratize, the red ones at the bottom, or are stable, or at least they're not moving that much, so we can say that they are clearly moving. And as you can see, the big chunk in the middle is still the biggest chunk. I think that's really important to keep in mind. So you can see the red lines going up towards the end at the bottom here. So more countries are autocratizing, more countries are in the red chunk than in the blue one right now, but the largest chunk is still the stability one. So we tend to follow news cycles and see countries moving in the wrong direction, like coups, extremely dramatic, but keep in mind that in most countries are relatively stable.
Thank you so much, Karl-Henrik. Thank you for giving us this really nuanced picture, but also I think many will realize what wonderful tools the VDEM project is bringing to all of us, but also the wealth of material and that's coming from your group as well at the University of Oslo. Department of Political Science, I didn't say that in the beginning. So thank you so much. And now we're going to move to different vantage points and also different disciplines, actually. So we're moving from political science to law. And we're going to have Satang Nabane give us a perspective from Africa. So it's only 52 countries. So in 15 minutes you can do it. So Satang is amazing. You were probably also there in 2015 for the first time, starting your, maybe 2016, I think, starting your PhD. So Satang did her PhD on one of the law transform projects on political determinants of sexual and reproductive health in Africa, and did it quickly. Did another PhD at the same time, I don't know, on democracy in Africa. At the University of Seattle, so one at the University of Pretoria, where we had the collaboration, and then one in Seattle where you were living with your family, commuting. And then you've been with us in many different capacities for these years. And now you're at University of Dayton. And also Africa Today was naming you as one of the 10 African scholars to watch this year. So that is amazing. And of course, with the bar raised really, really high, I'm giving you the word.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Siri. Hi, everyone. Always good to be back in my favorite place. I mean, I was here in March, so that felt like yesterday. But thank you again for the invitation to join this keynote opening session. This is my 8th Bergen Exchanges. So I'm one of the youngest, but also the most seasoned law transformers as well. And so I have been asked to do the impossible task of looking at the state of democracy from an African perspective in less than 15 minutes. And we all know that Siri is very strict with time, so I'll try to stick to that. So I'll just do broad strokes as well. Many thanks to Carl for setting the stage, makes it easier for all of us, especially just engaging in some of the wider issues as well. I think, when I was asked to I saw my name on the program, to do this particular session, it's law transform. It's fine. I think when I looked at the topic and the ask, I think it really depends on who you ask about the state of democracy in Africa, right? As Carl highlighted, especially with global indices, whether that's VDEM, Freedom House, the Mo Ibrahim index for governance, or in cases, there is always an indication, for instance, that democracy, especially within the African context, is likely remain unchanged. However, if you ask the everyday person, perhaps on the street, they'll tell you things are going bad, they are deteriorating, right? So I think part of the takeaway really is acknowledging that there are diverse trends, especially as it relates to democracy across the continent, given, as alluded by Carl, but which I will also go into a little bit as well, the comeback of coup d'etats, especially in West Africa, particularly in the Sahel countries, the continued civil and political conflict that we've seen in many parts of Africa, including Sudan, which all highlight the challenges of democratic consolidation in that sense. What I wanted to do really in the next perhaps 12 minutes is try to zero this in on two key issues. One is trust and participation, which obviously is broad, but I'll zero in on key issues, as well as the issue of conflict and security, obviously within the African context as well. I do think globally, as we know, obviously the global crisis, the global financial crisis, including debt, fiscal crisis, but also the requirement for austerity measures, particularly in various African countries, coupled with the failure of governments to create economic opportunities, especially for young people, are increasingly undermining public trust in politicians and institutions. I believe that thriving democracy is built on trust, trust between citizens and their elected officials as well. And without trust, obviously, we see these institutions, we see a heightened request and a growing discontent rather, that fuels popular uprisings as well. Obviously, we cannot do the state of democracy in 2024 without talking about Gen Z protests, particularly in Kenya, but also in other African countries that we've seen as well. As we know, Kenya has been rocked over the past couple of months over the contentious tax bill that represents a significant challenge to President Ruto's presidency. The Reject Finance Bill 2024 hashtag movement, as we know, ignited protests in Nairobi, but also in many parts of Kenya, which was largely driven by young Kenyans determined to shape Kenya's economic trajectory. They organized on social media, whether that's X, whether Instagram or TikTok, which they obviously then took offline as well. As we know, according to the 2019 census, young Kenyans form at least 75% of the population. And so I think part of what is interesting, even with the protests as well, is that the protest started obviously over the contentious tax bill, which then sort of shifted to addressing issues of corrupt leadership, corrupt political elected officials, and so the hashtag also then switched to hashtag Ruto must go, right? I think what we've seen in the Kenyan context is that the protest itself is unprecedented. Obviously, protest is nothing new in the Kenyan context, but I think what is interesting and insightful as well, not just the fact that it's a Gen Z, perhaps unorganized movement. What we see is that the movement also is particularly not related to a political parties or ethnic affiliations that we've seen obviously in the past as well, and primarily comprised, obviously, as I said, of young people. The response has been severe. Obviously, we saw live bullets being used. A number of young Kenyans died. Arrest and detention, and some of these issues are still ongoing as well. I think with the Reject Finance Bill 2024 that we saw in Kenya, obviously it is also in line with or aligns with the broader political movement that we've recently seen, whether that's the NSAS in Nigeria, Fees Must Fall in South Africa, as well as in other places. We've also sort of seen an offshoot, perhaps, of the Gen Z protest in Kenya, which has sort of inspired protests in Uganda as well. Recently, especially given that young people as well as others in Uganda have organized to peacefully march to parliament to make their voices heard in relation to addressing issues of enactment of electoral reform, safeguarding human rights, combating corruption, but also obviously the main issue of addressing youth unemployment as well. The response, severe as well, obviously in the Ugandan context. And I think what the Ugandan context also provides insights into whether and how grassroots activism has the potential to catalyze or not broader social movements, particularly on the political repression. I'm sure these are themes that we'll talk about more today as well as for the rest of the week as well. Quote unquote, the summer of discontent within the African context, not just in the context of Kenya, Uganda. We've also seen protests as well in Ghana, protests as well in Nigeria around some of these issues as well. I think one of the takeaways is that these popular movements in countries like Kenya, like in Ghana, as well as others, have proven essential in holding governments accountable, particularly when traditional modes of holding government accountable fail. The prevalence of violence obviously associated with these protests, as we've seen, obviously means that they serve as a last recourse mechanism as well. The tactics by authorities, in such movements, not only targeting protests, but also support organizations as well. We've seen this particularly even within the US context. I'm sure Don will talk a little bit about that perhaps. But it is this idea that you're not just targeting protesters, but you're also targeting support movement, support organizations, means also that sustaining the infrastructure needed to sustain such political movement then becomes critical as well, given that solidarity itself is criminalized in this particular sense. Just a question that I wouldn't really answer, but I think an ongoing question really is thinking about how we broaden and deepen broader participation, particularly as it relates to the demographic majority in Africa, and that's young people as well as women as well. Just quickly, I'm going to turn to the issue of how, especially the continued issues of conflict and insecurity, continue to threaten democracy and human rights within the continent. I think there is a general consensus that the decades-long multi-layered crisis that we see within Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is a governance problem, right? Whether those are, as I said, the rise again of coups d'etats, unchecked state violence, foreign military interventions, intercommunal clashes, transnational crime, terrorist insurgencies, particularly in the Sahel, as well as a pervasive culture of impunity. The region obviously is plagued by mass atrocities, including sexual and gender-based violence. We do have, I think, a session later on transitional justice and what that looks like as well. Obviously, these are all underlined by a deficient constitutional framework, evident in many parts of the continent as well. I think when you look at the escalating political crisis and violence that we've seen, as I mentioned before, in Sudan, but also in Burkina, in the DRC, Cameroon, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, and Sudan, which I already mentioned, continue to pose, obviously, a challenge as it relates to the state of democracy and democratic consolidation generally. Obviously, we cannot talk about this without recognizing as well that the instability is exacerbated by the geopolitical competition that we see, whether that's the US, the UK, China, Russia, and all of the key players that are within the African context also, which obviously cannot be underestimated, and there needs to be, urgent need rather, to address the security and governance issues across the continent. You know, Carl already mentioned the coup d'etats. Obviously, last year as well, my good brother from Senegal gave a highlight of the coup d'etats resurgence that we see in West Africa, particularly in the Sahel. And so you're really thinking about how the rise in coup d'etats we've seen both from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, obviously in 2023, as well as military transitions in Gabon, Niger, Burkina Faso, as well as others. Recently, in May, we also saw another attempted coup d'etat in the DRC as well. Obviously, there is the continued immeasurable humanitarian crisis ongoing in Sudan as well. I think what is interesting, especially with the rise of the coup d'etats, is really that the coup leaders really claim that they're trying to address the issue of political and social dysfunction. Obviously, I am from a country, the Gambia, which was promised back in 1994 when a coup d'etat happened, that the coup leader came to address our political and social crisis. 22 years later, the unintended consequences we continue to feel in the Gambian context. So I think it is a good example of the fallacy that coups are there to really address the issue of political and social dysfunctions as well. I think the rupture, really, in terms of constitutional order, often creates, obviously, a cycle of political instability and enhanced insecurity, as we've seen as well. I mean, within the West African region, particularly questions of the double standards, especially as it relates to, France interference, really comes out as well, especially with regard to the coup d'etats. There is a rise in anti-French, anti-France intervention based on several factors, whether those are including decades of colonial exploitation, neo-colonial influences, as well as others, where really the coup leaders we've seen are really benching on this idea that they're really there to address some of these key issues as well. And so it then becomes that citizens then, welcome those sort of developments in those instances, even though, as I said, in the longer term, then it becomes really problematic as well, given the ongoing crisis and the challenges, especially in the Sahel, as it relates to with constitutional order, governance, and backsliding as well. I think recent development, especially within those countries, is that Mali, Niger, and Burkina obviously formed the Alliance of Sahel States. They've also expressed their intention to withdraw from ECOWAS, which is the Economic Commission of West African States. This is an indictment on ECOWAS' failure to address unconstitutional changes within the region, but also brings into question broader debate, especially around the use of the CFA France, which obviously includes the three countries, but also others as well, including Senegal, as well as the other countries, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Guinea-Bissau, and Togo as well, related to issues of domestic sovereignty as well. In a couple of minutes, I know I have a couple of minutes, to say that only one, that all is not doom, right? There are rays of hope as well. Obviously, despite the political impasse, we saw a life-changing, I suppose, election in Senegal recently, as well as what we've seen in South Africa as well, even though there are remaining questions as to state whether, for the first time since 1994, with the ANC losing the majority and forming a coalition government with the DA, whether that is good for democracy or not, I think remains an open question as well. So to say that whilst obviously there are ongoing challenges that, in less than 15 minutes, I try to portray that there are rays of hope, but also continued engagement as well around some of these issues as well. Thank you.
Extremely interesting. Thank you so much, Satang. Before I go to the next speaker, I just want to mention that there will be time for questions and comments, as always, every session, and you always queue. So if you know who he is, so when Namita, who will be the last one, when she's sort of starting to finish, and if you really want to ask, you can start queuing. You can start queuing now. Yes, but before I'll give the word to Namita, we're going to hear from Dan Briggs, and who's a professor of, he's sort of both a lawyer and a political scientist, which is a lawyer, first a lawyer, practicing law, then doing a PhD in political science, then teaching both. And actually, he was the first opening keynote at the very first, in 1990, exactly 10 years ago. Right. So, and it's really been throughout the pillar of law reform, both in terms of conceptualization and sort of carrying it out. So you have so it's not as many countries, but you also have like a small task in 15 minutes to give us the state of democracy in the Americas.
Great, thank you so much. So, yes, 10 years of trying to address too many issues in too little time about things that we may or may not know too much about. But yeah, so I've been asked to talk about the state of democracy in the Americas, and you know what they say, Africa is a really big country. Latin America is also a pretty big country, but not quite as big. And there's a lot going on, a lot of changes. So I'm actually going to use VDEM to paint the broader picture and then go into some of the specifics. So I plotted. So I looked at the regional average over time. 2002 was sort of the peak for the regional average of democracy. I'm using the polyarchy measure, which is a sort of kind of more emphasis on electoral democracy, the more procedural measure. And 2002 was the peak of democracy for the region. And then I plotted that against 2023, which is the last piece of data I had. And as you can see from the red dot in the middle, the region as a whole has come down. I didn't plot the uncertainty sort of around that estimate, but I think it's significantly down from 2002. And when you look at the countries, you can start to see some of the things that Karl-Henrik was talking about. So, we have declines at every level, right? So there are only 4 countries above the diagonal line, which means only 4 countries have higher scores today than they did in 2002. Part of that is a little bit of a artifact of just picking 2 data points, but I think it does reflect the global trend, and it's happening at the high sort of end of democracy, right? So countries that we've long thought were sort of stalwarts of democracy in the region, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Chile, are all sort of suffering. Those are probably close to the. There's probably enough uncertainty there that they might be on the line or something, but the fact that they're all below the line, I think, tells us something as well. Argentina, my own country, is a little bit above the line. A little bit of that is, we can talk about that more in a minute. So, but we have kind of the most improved award goes to Colombia. If you remember maybe summer camp, that's partly a function of where you start as much as a function of where you end, right? So if you're not doing too well at the beginning, you get the most improved award at the end. So Colombia is improving, but Colombia still has enormous problems with violence, particularly violence along the dimensions that Karl-Henrik was talking about, right? Attacks on civil society leaders, freedom of speech issues, and violence more generally. We have the sort of stagnant middle, a bunch of countries in the middle that are just keep moving along at sort of middling to poor levels of democracy, and then of course we have countries that have suffered more significant declines that started up at reasonably high levels. Countries like Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Mexico, and Mexico in particular, that has suffered a pretty significant decline in measures of democracy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second as well. And then we have sort of the black sheep of the region, the countries that everybody sort of acknowledges are really sliding into much more autocratic patterns, and El Salvador is the least extreme of that group, but Venezuela and Nicaragua, Venezuela in particular, is troubling because for many, many years it was a stable democracy. It was at times one of the only 2 democracies in the whole region, and now it's really one of the worst performing countries. Nicaragua is also especially troubling because it started higher than all the others in this group and ended lower, so it fell quite a bit further. What's interesting about this is that the pattern looks sort of universal. There are a few countries that escape this downward trend, but for the most part, everybody's sliding down there. And when you look at what's happening underneath the number, it's very much the sort of thing that Karl-Henrik was talking about. It's very much sort of declines along the liberal dimension of democracy, failures of institutional performance, failure of mechanisms of checks and balances. In many of these countries, not so much a loss of the free press. The free press has been actually pretty resilient in the region in many countries, though obviously not all. Until you get further down in the decline. But very much sort of a pattern that starts, so unlike Africa, for example, not a coup-led pattern, not breaks from outside, but breaks from within the regime itself, elected officials eroding, evacuating the content of democracy. Very much still a persistence of electoral inclusion, more people voting, but then elected officials taking the opportunity to try to erode and weaken and undermine checks and balances. But that's sort of the how of how this is happening, not the why, right? And for me, the question, the really interesting question is, why is this happening across so many countries at so many different levels of democracy in ways that are actually pretty similar, but for reasons that feel pretty disparate? If you think about, so El Salvador, that's a sort of deeply security-affected country with lots of violence and criminal gangs, and the response to that is this sort of draconian security state that eliminates kind of civil and political rights for everyone in pursuit of greater social stability or greater citizen security. But then, we also had the right-wing populists, right? So Brazil, if I had taken that measure, if I had stopped measuring a few years earlier, Brazil would be lower still, right? During the Bolsonaro years, and that was very clearly sort of this right-wing populist project of kind of attacks on the media, attacks on civil society, attacks on civil liberties. And then, but then we also have that same phenomenon sort of from the left, right? So we have Mexico, where we have similar things going on, including right now after the most recent election with I don't know, should I call them attacks on the judiciary? I mean, a reform, a constitutional reform that is sold as a way to bring the system of justice, the courts, closer to the people by electing judges at all levels, but that in many ways is just a way to erode judicial independence and the possibility of checks on executive action. What's interesting is we had that essentially the same impulse taking place in Argentina, right? A project during the Cristina Kirchner years that was called like democratizing the judiciary, which was very much sold as a way to say, look, the courts are too remote, they're elitist, they're not of the people, and we need to bring them closer to the people, but in ways that are I don't know, at least from my perspective, kind of transparently meant to bring the courts closer to populist leaders and to turn them into less of a check on that. But again, very different impulses, and some of the countries. So some of the countries that start under this sort of populist mode then keep sliding and sliding and sliding. You could have said, Venezuela was this sort of left-wing populist project during the Chavez years, but by now it's sort of a kleptocracy that is, keeping Maduro and his cabal in power just for venal and personal purposes, at least from my perspective. So it just seems like there's a lot of different things going on at all levels of democracy, and that the answer very often to whatever the challenge is to erode and reduce democracy and the way that democracy is meant to function. So what's happening in the region as a whole? And I don't know the answer. Just to be clear, but there's a recent book. Well, it's not out yet, but by Benjamin Garcia Delgado and Scott Mainwaring, who kind of talk about the process, why Argentina is actually on the right side of the line, and what they say is that there was a sort of dual process of cultural transformation after the dictatorship period, in which the society really learned a lot about sort of the atrocities of the military regime, and the whole process of constructing historical memory, of recovering the voices of the victims of the repression, and bringing those forward, made it clear what the cost of losing democracy was to the population. And there was also a process of sort of elite learning. Political actors learned that although turning in an autocratic direction can sometimes seem like the quick, the easier, the more efficient solution to whatever the social problem is, that it actually doesn't solve those problems, as you were saying. Coups actually don't fix things. They don't fix the economy. They don't fix democracy. They don't fix the rule of law. And so many of them were sold that way to us. And it seems like the sort of the right, which was the side that used to turn to the coups, learned that they weren't going to get what they needed that way. And the left, which at one point had despaired of what they called bourgeois democracy, and thought that the way to get what they needed was through violence and through weapons, they learned that that wasn't going to work either. And so everybody had sort of committed to democracy as the way to move forward with all its checks, with all its inefficiencies, with all its weaknesses. And they find that in Argentina, those things are still strong. But I wonder if the rest of the region hasn't sort of lost that resistance to autocratization. And that the way to think about this is in a way, not to say, like, what's the sole cause of this global trend, but why has our sort of inoculation against autocracy weakened over time? And why is it that we're so willing, once again, to turn to strong leaders, to authoritarian leaders, to the erosion of checks and balances every time we need to solve a problem, whatever it is. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dan. And I think that's an issue that we'll come back to a couple of times during this, several times during this week. So the last keynote speaker today is Namita Vahi, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. And this is, I mean, Namita has sort of in a very sort of physical and personal way experienced a lot of the autocratic pressures in the Indian context. So I'm really I'm looking forward to hearing your take on that today. But I also wanted you to look a little bit more broadly, and not least to Bangladesh, which is also in the region and that also is experiencing a lot of contestations now. So, I mean, Africa is a big country, India is a big continent. So you also have an enormous task. So please, Namita.
Thank you, Siri. Can everyone hear me?
I think they will do it from there.
Hello. Yes. Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure and privilege to be here as part of the opening keynotes at the Bergen Exchanges and to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Bergen Exchanges with all of you. So I just want to thank Siri and congratulate you on what you have managed to accomplish here, and Lara and everyone at Law Transform. And I just want to say that just like with democracy, it is easy to create and harder to nurture and sustain over time. So it is easy to create something like this platform of the Bergen Exchanges, but it is really wonderful and remarkable that you have sustained it over 10 years and provided us with an intellectual family, but also so much camaraderie and friendship, which has been really important in the last decade. And looking forward as we set the research agenda for the next decade, also renewing those bonds of friendship for the next decade. So thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists for your really wonderful thoughts and presentations. 2024 is a really momentous year for democracy in the world because nearly 50% of the world's population is going through elections, and as many as 64 countries. We've already had in many countries and many more to follow. 25% of the world's population lives in South Asia, which consists of 7 countries, namely India, the world's most populous country and largest democracy, consisting of nearly 18% of the world's population, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which together constitute about 5% of the world's population, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and the island nation of Maldives, which also constitute together about 1 to 2% of the world's population. And I want to say that the first half of 2024 was rather despairing for democracy in South Asia. In January this year, the ruling Awami League party in Bangladesh, led by their Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, conducted and won elections in a landslide after being in power for 15 years. While these 15 years saw remarkable economic progress in Bangladesh, because ever since its independence from Pakistan in 1972, Bangladesh was one of the poorest countries in the world, and over the last 2 decades, it saw a tripling of its GDP per capita, fueled largely by the garment industry and remittances, so much so that Bangladesh is now on track to move out of the world's least developed countries by 2026. But this period of economic progress was also tempered by severe political repression, and more than 8,000 opposition leaders and activists were arrested before the January elections, which were clearly not fair and free, and the leading opposition party in the Bangladesh Nationalist Party boycotted those elections. So that's how this year began. In February, sham elections were also held in Pakistan following 2 years of political unrest after Prime Minister Imran Khan of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf party was removed from office by a no-confidence motion in the Pakistani parliament. Subsequently, Khan was arrested and convicted for corruption and barred from politics for 5 years. In the run-up to the February elections, the Supreme Court of Pakistan stripped the PTI, that is Imran Khan's party, of the electoral symbol for failing to hold intra-party elections for years. So this was clearly a sham election, and with the military takeover. So meanwhile, in India, the giant of South Asia, in the first half of the year, we saw a continuation of the policies of the past decade since the BJP-led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi government came into power. These policies over the last 10 years included the dilution of many progressive human rights-based legislation in India, like the Right to Information Act, the Forest Rights Act, the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act, as well as other progressive environmental laws, including amendments to the forest laws. In December last year, the Indian Parliament overhauled colonial-era substantive and procedural criminal laws and laws relating to evidence with zero debate after suspending 140 opposition members of Parliament. But on the whole, over these past decade, we also saw the effective use of existing laws and weaponization of existing law enforcement agencies to target the opposition. The process of erasure of dissenting voices began with the targeting of political opposition and was extended to the press, academia, and civil society, including NGOs and research think tanks like my organization, the Center for Policy Research. Kim Lane Shepley is here with us, and she has written extensively about autocratic legalism in Eastern Europe. And much of what happened in India had similarities to what you have identified in Eastern Europe. Populism, the appeal of a strong masculine leader, although in the case of Bangladesh, it is a strong feminine leader. Criticism of whom can lead to immediate targeting and possibly imprisonment, silencing of voices in parliament, control over the media, attempts to pack institutions like the courts and election commissions, filling of universities with appointments of people who were ideologically aligned with the ruling party, and shutting down critical and independent voices like think tanks like the Center for Policy Research. But in many ways, and I think so the first point I wanted to highlight was that we have seen that greater economic progress can only work up to a point when it comes alongside political repression, is what we've seen in Bangladesh. The second point is about India, that in many ways, which the autocratization literature does not address, is how in India, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, which is the ideological parent of the BJP, also has fascist impulses with the idea of Hindu superiority, Hinduism being the dominant religion in India, and the creation of an akhand or undivided Bharat or India. Various legislation like the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens are attempts to remake India in the form of a Hindu Rashtra, which is different from the secular republic that India was conceived to be at the time of independence. Indeed, what is happening in India is similar to the idea that led to the recognition of Israel as a democratic Jewish state. Israel has always been an uncomfortable example of a liberal democracy that the Western world has simply lived with, and on the VDEM indices is considered higher than many of the countries that we are talking about here. And therefore, for the BJP, India could still be a liberal democracy with a Hindu Rashtra. Indeed, Israel is the inspiration for this new idea of India, as it was the inspiration for the idea of Pakistan, which led to its fall from an originally secular to an increasingly ethno-nationalist and religious state, along with the military takeover. And that is the question we need to think of in the context of the autocratization project. Is it ever possible for a religious state to even be a liberal democracy? And of course, we are seeing that with repression. Not only is Israel an apartheid and genocidal state, but it is also repressing civil society protests within Israel. So in line with this, over the last 10 years, we saw rewriting of Indian history, deleting history of the Mughals, Muslim rulers who ruled India for more than 400 years, and overplaying the legacy of the Hindu kings in India. Similarly, we saw deletion of chapters on democracy and civil society from textbooks. We saw ultra-nationalism and personification of the cult of the leader into the nation. This could be seen from the fact that on 22nd January this year, the Prime Minister inaugurated a temple to Lord Ram, the deity of Hindus, built on a site where the Babri mosque, constructed by the Mughal king Babur, was demolished by mobs led by the RSS. And later in January, the government, the Indian government, conferred India's highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna, on Lal Krishna Advani, who had led the mob that led to the destruction of the Babri mosque. Between January to April, the government arrested various members of the opposition in India, including the sitting Chief Minister of the state of Delhi, from which I come, Arvind Kejriwal, and Hemant Soren, Chief Minister of the state of Jharkhand, which has a 25% indigenous population, in cases of alleged corruption and money laundering. The arrest of the Chief Minister of Delhi came on the heels of the arrests of other members of the Delhi cabinet, such that most of the influential leaders of that political party are in jail. Last year, Rahul Gandhi, the leader of the largest opposition party in India, the Indian National Congress, was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in jail for a defamation case and disqualified from parliament, but that conviction was stayed by the Supreme Court. The bank accounts of the main opposition party, the Congress, were frozen in March this year, just before India went into its mammoth general election. Now, major structures of power like opposition parties and centers of intellectual thought like universities have also been targeted, along with human rights activists. India has seen a decline in its academic freedom index. The use of laws of taxation, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act has been used, and the law enforcement agencies have been used to financially choke and cripple institutions, including my think tank, which since 22, when this harassment began, has been reduced from 200 people to 20, from 30 faculty to 6, most of whom are working unpaid. So this is where we were in April 2024, when India began its election. But the second half of the year, starting June, so the first half of the year was despairing for democracy. The second half of the year is, I think, the beginnings of hope. The seeds of hope have been planted, because in June, 640 million Indians voted in the largest election in world history and dealt the ruling BJP a small defeat. But in the words of Neil Armstrong, it was a small defeat for the BJP, which only lost 63 seats compared to what it had in parliament. But it was a giant leap for democracy in India, because India finally returned to the era of coalitions after 10 years. The BJP is back in power. Narendra Modi is still the prime minister, but not as the head of a majoritarian government, but rather the head of a coalition government. And I say this for two reasons, which may not be captured by quantitative data sets, but rather by qualitative understandings of the sentiments and on the ground. That essentially, to defeat a ruling party which had absolute hegemony in terms of money to contest elections, control of the law enforcement agencies, control of a large majority of the TV and press news and print media, massive amounts of disinformation during the campaign, and drunk on its own hubris, had promised to come back to power with 400 seats. Ultimately, they got 240. So to defeat this ruling party was no mean feat. And I also say this because what was on the ballot, what was the campaign about? The Constitution of India was on the ballot in this election, as the Congress used some loose statements made by some BJP candidates to tell the people that if the BJP came back to power as a majoritarian 400 party, 400, we have 545 seats in parliament, so 400 is an absolute majority. They had 303 in the last election, now they have 240. But they used some statements by these candidates to tell the people that if the BJP came to power, they would amend the Constitution of India and alter its secular and social justice character. So this was an election where people were voting not just about economic distress because India has low inflation compared to the rest of the world, but high unemployment rates, very high unemployment rates for a very young population that led to this verdict. It's not just economic distress that led to this verdict, but really it was a fight about the idea of India. It was also a personal defeat for the Prime Minister who had made himself the face of this election campaign. He won in his own constituency by the lowest vote margin of any Prime Minister in Indian history. This is the holy city of Varanasi. And finally, the BJP was also defeated in Ayodhya, which is where the temple to Lord Ram was constructed on the ruins of the Babri Mosque. How did this victory come about? It came about through relentless and concerted efforts by courts, civil society, and journalists. In March this year, the Supreme Court, after sitting on this case for years, finally handed down a verdict in what is known as the electoral bonds case. This was essentially a case where a new scheme of election financing, which was unveiled in 2018, was contested before the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional for violating the right to freedom of information and also other liberties in the Constitution. So the court struck down the electoral bond scheme, which was essentially how corporates could donate money anonymously to various political parties, including foreign money. So they don't like foreign money for the non-profit sector, but it's okay to donate for foreign corporations to donate money to political parties in India. This scheme was struck down, but what was even more useful was the data that came out as to who had, because the Supreme Court ordered the disclosure of who had made donations to who. And as journalists and civil society worked relentlessly to piece together the data and the information that came out, it became very clear, not only the fact that, which corporates were donating to which parties, but also the fact that many of these donations followed tax raids by law enforcement agencies. So in many ways, very quickly, the veneer of legitimacy that was there with this government cracked, and that is what led to the small defeat, but big leap for democracy. Finally, in July this year, student protests began in Bangladesh. These were sparked by a decision of the High Court of Bangladesh to reinstate a quota system for jobs, reserving a full 30% of government jobs for descendants of veterans of Bangladesh's War of Independence. This was an important constituency for the ruling Awami League party. The High Court's decision led to widespread dissatisfaction among students and young professionals who viewed the quota as discriminatory and favoring political elites. Amid political tension and economic dissatisfaction, the Students Against Discrimination movement, and this is what gives me a lot of hope as well, cautious optimism, is that the Students Against Discrimination movement, student-led protest, protested against these quotas. It was met with backlash and severe repression by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, eventually leading to the killing of many protesters as well as police officials. And finally, the army was called in, but the army refused to cooperate to use violence against the students, and that has led to the ouster of the Prime Minister, which also is a positive thing. I mean, earlier, and we saw that President Trump was tried to be assassinated. I'm hopeful that ousters and not assassinations are going to be the way for the future, even for autocratic leaders. And so she fled the country to India, and India had backed the Awami League party through all this, through all its policies of authoritarianism. And that is the situation as we speak of right now. There has been there's been violence against, as the movement the situation is very volatile. There is an interim government. There has been violence against Hindus in Bangladesh, which is being used to create disinformation by the ruling party in India to again push forward the ethno-nationalist project of how Hindus will be safe only in India, and therefore we need to extend citizenship to Hindus from all over, which was the basis of the Citizenship Act. So it's a very volatile and difficult situation, but there is a lot of hope. It seems as if the dark shadow that was there, we see the cracks and the light is beginning to come in.
Thank you. Wow. That was really amazing. We have a lot. We've had a lot in an hour. I will actually move. Yes. I'm going to move it so that you can see you, Saz. So, okay. Okay. I think this is when we do the, so everybody gets to ask and you get to respond to whatever at the end. Okay. But if you look back, you realize you need to be short. Okay, thank you. Nilufer starts.
Thank you, everyone. But my question is to Namita, my friend. I'm from Bangladesh and a student of UiB. So my question is about the media, how India actually use media about explaining the situation of Bangladesh this protest. Because I have seen many of the Indian medias were actually explaining the whole situation in negative way. So which actually give us more pressure to retain the democracy. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So you can say your name as well, just quickly.
Yeah, I am Nilufer.
Yeah.
From Bangladesh. Yeah.
And from Law Transform.
Yeah, I'm from Bangladesh.
Hi, I'm Rachel Cedar from CSS in Mexico and from Law Transform, and thank you all for the panel. My questions are many to Dan, particularly about Latin America. I'll try, and I'm kind of riffing off some of the things from others as well. So, Gen Z, what's its role in all of this? Gen Z in Latin America, in terms of electoral outcomes, and then something we were talking about last night about like undermining checks and balances, how most of the electorate are just not engaged in the complexity of the policy reforms around, say, judicial reform in Mexico at the moment, so kind of how much is that a factor? And then the army, which people have mentioned for other regions, so kind of, which was what we all studied for Latin America of transition, so kind of what would you say about the role of the military in this democratic backsliding in the region? Is there something that we can say generally, or kind of, because you didn't mention the military at all, so could you? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bjørte Bjørsvik from the Green Party of Norway. I want to pick up on one of your points, Karl-Henrik, mentioning the backslide democracy. One of the main reasons are elected leaders actually undermine it when they come in position. So what I wonder about is political parties, the role of them. We are now, for instance, starting a project with government funding to strengthen the Green Party of Lebanon. But my questions are two. Do you have any indicators, and that's all over the line, of, like them or not, political parties, but they are at the core, more or less, right, of the system. Indicators of how the internal democracy of the parties works. Has that also been backsliding? And the second question is what to do. Kind of how to strengthen the parties, right, so they become well-functioning outside funding and programs and so on, which has been going on for years. Is that helpful?
So thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I'm Irene, University of Lausanne, and I am an anthropologist, absolutely not a specialist of these issues. So I will ask some very general questions. The first one is about the conception of the panel, because so there are some regions represented, let's say from the global south. What about, for example, the global north? So we know what's going on, for example, in the US in the last few years, in Europe, so our Middle East. So I wanted to know how did you choose the areas and why global north is not represented? First question. And second question is about, you gave some elements about the definition of democracy, and you talked about autocracy, autocratic regimes. Is there a model of autocracy, or are there several ways where democracy doesn't work or is contaminated by other kind of regimes? And can we identify a kind of model circulating globally? So this is another question. And about the decline, let's say, of democracies, could we identify economic factors and the way economy works today as an important factor? So it's a question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jackie Dugard from WITS and Columbia University. Thank you for a really amazing panel. I wanted to just piggyback a bit on that last comment. So what I felt would be interesting to hear from is economic inequality, what role that has. And increasingly, from my perspective, I see that it is impossible to talk about democracy in the world, and in particular countries with rising economic inequality, whether between countries or within them, and the question of whether it is actually at all possible to have democracy and billionaires and unaccountable power, economic power of corporations, specific countries like the US, and billionaires. Thank you.
My name is Lisa Wagner from this university, from Law Transform. And Jackie, the next panel will respond to your question. So that's number one. Which means that I can take some space to ask another question. Generation Z. I think it was Satang mentioning it, but the one of you has an answer to this. I would sort of put it to the whole panel. In your work and in your regions and your work, do you see any forms of democratic innovation, like new forms, new institutions, new forms of participation that you would like to share with us? Because is there new ways of thinking around democracy that maybe particularly would appeal to younger people, Generation Z? So good ideas, if you have, and perspectives. Thank you.
My name is Alicia Yeaman, and I'm from Harvard University as well as Law Transform. Super happy to be here again. So I actually want to pick up on Jackie's and Irene's question a little and ask you about political economy. Satang noted in Kenya the Anti-Finance Act and the effects of what the World Bank and the IMF were demanding. And I'm specifically wondering, what are the effects of a renewed wave of debt distress, austerity, knowing what that does to cuts in public sector wages, services, et cetera, increases in transport prices because of cuts in subsidies, on and on and on, and how that fuels discontent, lack of trust in institutions, et cetera, in these different regions. Thank you.
Thank you for this very wonderful panel. My name is Talia. I am from Tilburg University and also from Law Transforms. My question ties back to what Alicia and Jackie have also brought to the table, and that relates to the multipolarity of our world today. Satang gestured to the geopolitics, but my question is more tied to the economic interests, particularly on oil and resources, that the multipolar world right now has accommodated in a very specific senses, and that underpins political transnational networks to favor certain regimes in the world. So for instance, in the Venezuelan case, there has been said that those countries that actually have recognized Maduro's win are those who have a certain political project geopolitically. So I wonder what's your reading about that? Thank you.
Thank you all for the amazing keynotes. My name is Sofia Rolim. I'm from FGV in São Paulo. I have a question specifically for Namita regarding the protests in Bangladesh, but I think it might be relevant to other panelists as well. So I was very struck by the fact that the army did not comply with the government's orders and refused to repress the protests, right? So I'm very interested in these processes of autonomization of security forces from the government, be it the army or the police. I was wondering, well, why do you think that happened? I mean, what was the army expecting? Were they allied with another political power? Did they think that, if Sheikh Hasina was toppled, then they could have a greater political prominence, or were they just in agreement with the students and decided to not comply. And also, well, we think of these autonomization processes as very bad things, but also in terms of how can social movements perhaps exploit these cracks and perhaps, have greater success in the movement. Thank you.
I'm Tania Groppi from Siena, Italy, and thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I have a question about federal accommodations. I mean, I consider this is an overlooked topic when we deal with backsliding. Then federal accommodation can be a target for the backsliders or can be also a tool to resist. We focus always on horizontal separation of powers, but what about vertical separation of powers? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. So many good questions. I think before giving the word to you, I'll say a little bit about the selection of perspectives. So one was that actually, Dan, you sort of didn't do quite the brief because I asked you to speak about the Americas, which is also sort of US, but of course it's big and everybody has to select certain countries. And so that's perfectly fine. But that was sort of one way of saying that that's also important. But the most important way, and then of course, Karl-Henrik is from Norway, which sort of, and he had the global perspective, so that I think answers some. But one of the main reasons is, of course, that we have an annual lecture coming up on Wednesday that Kim Lane-Sheppele, who's there already, and who we're really, really happy to have here, and who is sort of, I think for many of us, her sort of conceptualization of autocratic legalism has been very important to our way of thinking around democratic backsliding. She will give the annual lecture on Wednesday on we're actually quite optimistic on how transnational law can help in restoring democracy, but also with very much a European perspective. In part. So in part, because Kim is very much an expert on Eastern Europe. So we thought that sort of all together we'll have a bit more of a broad perspective. But actually, now you have 2 minutes each. That's almost a luxury to answer the questions that you'd like to answer. And I'll actually go in the order that you presented. So I'll let you go first, Kalan.
Thanks. There were a lot of great questions. I'll start with the autocracy models one. I think this is kind of it shows some of the issues with dealing in very broad categorizations. And I mean, the way political scientists treat autocracy or authoritarian regimes in the more recent literature, of course, there is more nuance to it and different uses of terminology. But it's typically as a regime that is where democracy is either absent or lacking to a very large degree. So by definition, it's a residual category, which means that it's extremely heterogeneous. So there's a lot of action going in. If you kind of look at that subset of regimes, it's a very varied group. And there's a lot of work, I think over the last, let's say, 25 years, I think there's been an increasing amount of work on autocratic politics in political science, for example, but also in other disciplines. And much of it has been conceptual, going into different dimensions, different models. So there are many ways of conceptualizing it. I think some of the more predominant ones look at kind of the institutions that are in place for regulating how leaders are selected or not. So is there a large mass party in place, a regime party? Is it the military? Is it the military junta that controls selection of leaders and so on? But there's of course another broad range of ways you can kind of slice up this group of countries. For example, looking at ideology or the motivations of leaders. So there are actually a larger set of autocratic models in place, perhaps even more variation than previously. I think one empirical change has been kind of the broader use of multi-party elections over recent years, so having that as a legitimation tool, so holding elections formally, but everyone knows who the winner is. I think that's kind of one drift, but I could speak for hours about this topic, so I'm actually very interested in autocratic politics. On the party question, that is a really good question. So when speaking about the VDEM indicators, there are indicators in there on how parties are organized. So the institutionalization of parties, So to what extent is our party centered around the person? Is there a clear organization in place with division of roles and rules for how decisions are made? Do they have a mass base? Are they located across the countries with different affiliate branches? So it's more about the organizational structure and strength of the parties, party institutionalization, and that seems to matter a lot for the robustness of democracies. It can actually matter a lot also for the robustness of autocracies if you have a regime party. But given that if you start out as a democracy, you would rather have one strong institutionalized parties if you want that democracy to persist, rather than a more person-centered, person-focused type of politics. And then there's also the question of the ideology of the parties and their actions and so on. And there's also interesting data on that, but less on internal party democracy. But there's other data for that. Have I spent my 2 minutes?
I think you have actually.
Yeah, okay, then I'll...
Yes, I think so, but there might be. We'll see.
We'll talk more about the economics side later.
The next panel is on economics, so that's good. So yes, Sabang.
Yeah, no, thank you, everyone, for the questions. Just quickly, in 2 minutes, I think some of the interrelated questions, especially around economic inequality, issues of the austerity measures, especially by IMF and others, I think really goes to the crux of the coloniality of multilateral architecture, multilateral financial architecture as well. Recently, the African Union joined the G20. It is seen as a good step, especially as it relates to the group of major economies, including South Africa, and the potential for that. I mean, there's a whole conversation about how good, and the opportunities, especially to address Africa's role and position in the international monetary financial architecture in that sense. But the whole question, I think, of economic inequality and people feeling like their elected officials are not really adhering and paying attention to their struggles, I think is the underlying cause for most of the protests that we've seen, as I mentioned, in Kenya, but also even in Ghana, with some of the measures that were proposed for the Ghanaian government to take up as well. And so linking back to, I think, Leif's question, especially around new ways of organizing, especially for Gen Z, as I mentioned, the use of social media. But I also think what is also interesting as well, even with thinking about new methods and tactics, with the emerging technologies that are used, obviously, to erode democratic values, also is a tool for resistance as well. We've seen not just the use of social media, but especially AI. I know there's a session that's going to be on AI, but really how Gen Z have used AI, especially in the Kenyan context, to sort of illustrate what is happening, as well as connecting it. So I think definitely in thinking about research and ways of bringing together, especially scholars and practitioners, I think is really deep in dive into new ways and methods of organizing and ways of supporting that, both in research but also in action as well. Thanks.
Wonderful.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the great questions, and I guess I'll start with Rachel's questions, and then maybe dip into a couple of the others. I think, and I'll start with this question of whether people really care or not when elected officials start to deconstruct sort of the institutional framework for a liberal democracy. And my sense is that by and large, they don't, right? I mean, and I think, there's a lot of literature in political science about courts and how courts depend on popular support. I personally don't believe that most of the time in most places. I think it's mostly sort of an elite game, right? And it's sort of like when the sort of key players at the top see it as being in their best interest to protect that sort of institutional framework of checks and balances, that it will survive. And when they lose faith in that game, then I think it's easy to sell the sort of anti-institutional populist project to the population. And part of that is I used to say, and maybe some of you can tell me if this is true or not. I mean, I used to think that there was a new sort of conception of democracy that had emerged in the region post after our authoritarian period, which was a human rights-based version or vision for democracy, where the way you knew whether you lived in a democracy or not was not necessarily because you got to go vote every 4 years or so, but because the government was actually respectful of human rights. And I think there was a strong element of that. It wasn't the whole thing, but there was a strong element of that, and that's the part that I think is fading. And so we've gone from this kind of human rights-based, which you could think of or denigrate maybe as a process-based vision for democracy, this liberal democracy, to a much more results-oriented version where what you really want are the outcomes, right? And democracy is supposed to deliver particular social goods, and if it doesn't, then we have to. Then we're going to look for somebody who promises to deliver those things, and that's.
I think, yeah. So I think that's actually how much you. That's how much you can say.
That's it. Okay. Well.
Because now the last 2 minutes has to go to Namita.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. So, thank you for all those questions. On Bangladesh, to Nilofar's question, I think that India was largely taken by surprise by the events in Bangladesh, and so the Indian media is figuring out and trying to make sense of things in real time. I think that there is a section of the media which is presenting, and a lot of disinformation about what's happening in Bangladesh was presenting things in a not so good light, but there is plenty of independent media. We've had many Bangladeshi human rights journalists, human rights activists, journalists come and speak on Indian television and write in the Indian newspapers about what's going on in Bangladesh, and to sort of take away the impression that this was orchestrated either by the military or by the United States, which is being, said that the United States effectuated a regime change. So there are all kinds of narratives floating around. It's too soon. It's been 2 weeks. But there is a lot of independent coverage of what's happening in Bangladesh as well. To the other question about the Bangladeshi military, I'm not sure. It's very interesting because the head of the military in Bangladesh was actually related to the Prime Minister, and it is not entirely clear as to why he took the decision that he did to not fire at the protesters. And I think that sort of speaks to political contingency as one of the factors in explaining some of these things that happen, and in the role of individuals. And oftentimes it is that one individual who decides to make that one decision which changes the outcome of the institutional project towards that. So that's on Bangladesh. And just on the point of democratic innovation, I think, Lisa, there's been considerable innovation actually in the Indian context, particularly because the TV media was almost completely captured, and so was a lot of the print media. This election was fought through social media and through YouTube. And one of the interesting things that has happened post this election is that the government, as part of its effort, they had been able to control the print and the TV media, but they had not yet been able to control the online media. So they are going to pass a broadcast law, which was introduced for comments. But because of severe criticism, for the first time, this government never rolled back anything in the last 10 years. It's rolled back the broadcast law 2 days ago.
Wonderful. Amazing. We're 1 minute over time. I just wanted to say thank you. This has been such an amazing start. And the good thing is you all want to hear more about the political economy. You'll get that after the break. I will just also, as tradition says, I'll give this year's cup to everyone for thanks.
Okay.